What's up, guys? Welcome to Fed by Fire. Most people think that slavery ended in 1965, that it ended with the Civil War, with the signing of the 13th Amendment, and that after that moment, the country entered a new era of freedom and labor rights. But the reality is a lot more complicated, because if you read the 13th Amendment closely, there's a single line that changes everything. It states that slavery and involuntary servitude is illegal except for its punishments for crime whereof the party has been duly convicted. That exception is a foundation for what is known today as penal labor in the United States. Penal labor is the practice of using incarcerated individuals to perform work while they are in prison or jail. That work can include manufacturing goods, agricultural labor, maintenance, cleaning, food service, packaging, and a wide range of institutional or contracted services. At the federal level, incarcerated workers are often paid between 12 and 40 cents per hour for institutional jobs, according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which is far below the federal minimum wage. These jobs often include kitchen work, laundry services, sanitation, plumbing, assistance, painting, warehouse work, as well as other things. In many institutions, the work is not optional. If an individual is medically able, they are typically assigned labor duties as part of their incarceration. On paper, this system is described as rehabilitation. Work is framed as structure, discipline, and preparation for reintegration into society. But the history of how this system developed tells us a much deeper story. After the Civil War ended in 1965, the Southern economy collapsed because entire industries that had been built on enslaved labor, that system had disappeared overnight. Plantations, railroad, agricultural, and an infrastructure that all depended on enslaved men and women. When slavery was accomplished, southern states were forced massive economic disruption, but instead of building an entirely new labor system based on free employment, many states moved quickly to reconstruct labor through the criminal justice system. This is where the Black Codes emerged. The Black Codes were laws passed across southern states that criminalized everyday life for newly freed Black Americans. Vagrancy, unemployment, loitering, and even changing employers without permission could lead to an arrest. In practice, these laws made freedom conditional. Once arrested and convicted, the exception clause in the 13th Amendment allowed forced labor legally under criminal punishment. And this gave the rise to one of the most controversial systems in our history, convict leasing. And convict leasing is allowed in states to lease incarcerated people to private companies, who use prison labor in things like coal mines, plantations, and other industrial operations that the state and private companies will gain cheap labor and profit from. Incarcerated people have almost no rights or protections. Conditions were often brutal, and they were minimal oversight for safety standards. They were poor, if non-existent, and because prisoners were leased rather than owned, companies had little incentive to protect their health or survival. Many died in the minefields and labor camps. In some states, convict leasing became a major source of public revenue. Over time, the convict leasing evolved into chain gangs and other forced labor systems where incarcerated individuals were used for all types of things like we discussed earlier, And a lot of times by unarmed supervision, these systems continued into the early 20th century before being gradually restricted through legal reforms. Federal and state systems began formalizing prison labor during the period the Hawes-Copper Act of 1929 restricted the interstate trade of prison-made goods. In 1934, federal prison industries was created to organize production inside federal prisons. Later in 1979, the Prison Industry Enhancement Certification Program was introduced. Incarcerated workers in certain conditions to work with private industry partners and in some cases earn wages closer to market rates. Portions of the earnings, though, may be allocated towards tactics, victims' compensation, family support, room and board, blah, blah, blah. Supporters argue that this system provides structure, reduces recidivism, and helps them get closer to release. Critics argue that the reality is a lot more complex, especially when the wages remain extremely low, participation is not always fully voluntary in practice, and today's prison labor remains a multi-million-dollar system in the United States. Incarcerated workers collectively produce billions of dollars in goods and services every year, including all the types of work we just talked about. And, this is no easy work, And some states have been involved in harvesting crops such as wheat, corn, and soybeans, as well as raising livestock, including cattle and dairy operations. These goods can enter large-scale agriculture supply chains that eventually reach national distribution systems. And a lot of things like clothing, textiles, incarcerated labor has been used to produce military uniforms, law enforcement gear, industrial clothing, and in some cases, a lot of commercial apparel through state-run or contracted facilities. Government-run prison industries play a major role in this system. Federal prison industries, also known as Unicor, along with state correctional industries, produce goods such as, we've seen in cartoons, the license plates, office furniture, benches, cleaning supplies, and maintenance equipment used by every government agency imaginable. In other areas, prison labor has been used in electronics, assembly, packaging, and all types of manufacturing roles, including breaking down electronic waste or assembling, packaging, or distribution. There are also specialized service roles where incarcerated individuals have been assigned to transcribe Braille materials, operate call centers, care for retired racehorses, and perform outsourced work for government or contracted entities. But investigative reporting has found that incarcerated labor can intersect with broad commercial supply chains, often indirectly through subcontractors, state correctional programs, or third-party vendors. These systems are complex and in many cases not transparent, which makes it difficult to trace exactly where prison goods are made and end up in the consumer economy. As a result, prison labor has been linked in reporting and investigations to a wide range of industries. And it's not going to stop, y'all. Think of how much stuff you're using in your kitchen and in your house that was made by a prisoner, either indirectly or directly. The supply chain connects. Rather than direct employment relationships, because the complexity of prison labor often exists inside that supply chain, most consumers will never see this. Supporters of the system argue that prison labor reduces incarceration costs, provides structure to inside facilities, and offers opportunities for skill development. Some incarcerated individuals also choose to participate because it gives them movement, income across the facility, or privileges within the system. But critics point to a different set of concerns. They argue that incarcerated workers cannot freely quit, that they cannot negotiate wages, and may face disciplinary consequences for refusing assignment labor. In some facilities, refusal can result in loss of privileges, solitary confinement even. This raises a central ethical question. If a person cannot leave, cannot refuse, and cannot negotiate pay, how is this different from forced labor? Y'all tell me in the comments. That question sits at the center of modern debates about prison labor. These debates intensified alongside the rise of mass incarceration in the late 20th century. During the war on drugs era, incarceration rates in the United States increased dramatically. Mandatory minimum sentencing and three strike laws and stricter drug enforcement policies all contributed to massive expansions of prison population. As incarceration expanded, so did the scale of prison labor systems. Today, the United States has one of the largest incarcerated populations in the world. This creates a system where millions of people cycle through incarceration labor programs and reentry processes that shape entire communities and economies. The economic structure surrounding prisons is also very significant. Prisons rely on government funding, private contractors for healthcare, food, and telecommunications companies. It takes a lot to run in a prison, and prison labor, they say, reduces operational costs and contributes to internal prison systems while also connecting to external production chains in some cases. This creates, competition amongst all of, the prisons that are working against each other with different type of labor programs. But there's a thin line between punishment, labor, and profit. At the center of this entire debate is the purpose of incarceration itself. Imprisonment is meant to punish and rehabilitate, to protect society, to deter crime, or to manage labor within a controlled system. Different people have different answers to that question. International comparisons show that prison systems vary widely across countries, and some prioritize rehabilitation and reintegration. Others emphasize punishment and control. The United States has historically leaned more towards punitive models, especially in the late 20th century. That history matters because the 13th Amendment did not simply end slavery and close the chapter on forced labor. It ended slavery in most contexts, but it preserved a legal exception that allowed involuntary servitude as criminal punishment. That exception has shaped every stage of prison labor in the United States, from post-Civil War black codes to convict leasing, from chain gangs to modern correctional industries. The system has evolved but never fully disappeared. Today, reform efforts continue across the country. Some states have voted to remove slavery exception clauses from their state and labor advocates continue pushing for higher wages for these men and women. More protections for incarcerated workers, and legal scholars continue debating whether federal reform is necessary to address the constitutional foundation of the system. But despite these ongoing debates, one fact remains unchanged. In the United States, forced labor is still legal under one condition: criminal conviction. And that reality forces a difficult conversation about history, justice, economics, and human rights. And it's still unresolved. When you trace the system from its origins to today, the question is not what the law says. The question is what it means. Whether a system is built on punishment or can ever fully separate itself from history that created it. The reason I made this video, guys, is I was at work listening to Vlad, and I heard him say that one of the Folio murderers had the warden from the prison come up on the stand and say, this is a strong young man, and, we don't think he needs the death penalty because we will work him until he's dead. So when you guys go out there doing murders, selling drugs, doing anything like that, just know they got a spot for you. Might be in the field, might be in a fucking warehouse, but they got something for you. So, keep that in mind, when you're desperate.